All right, welcome all. I hope everyone can hear me. I have the honor of opening the session for today. My name is Dietske Simons, and I'm the co-chair of the Joint Impact Modeling Foundation. So before we start, some housekeeping. If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A section, which is one of the icons at the bottom of your screen. And secondly, I wanted to note that the session will be recorded. We hope that for today we have an interesting agenda, and we hope that we will give you much more explanations about emissions reporting, PCAF, and the GHG. After my introduction, we have Sam Nierop from FMO. Sam is an emissions accounting expert who has been a member of the PCAF team over the past years, and he will explain more about the PCAF and how FMO uses GHG and its results. After Sam, the next speaker is our technical director of the GHG, which is Anies Lelyveld, and Anies will explain more about emissions and the team and the GHG. A bit of the recurring theme of today, right? Julia De Bernardini, the managing director of the GHG, will accordingly present some of our new developments and releases that we'll do in the GHG, because as you can imagine, we're not sitting still. And finally, my co-chair, Alex McGillivray, will update you on some of our initiatives like a pilot that we're currently running, and we'll make some closing remarks. But before giving the floor to Sam, I would like to say a few more words about our initiative and where we stand. A few years ago, a few institutions at the time were doing impact modeling, but every organization had their own way of going about it. And results were therefore incomparable. We were all spending significant resources, and we were asking for different data from our clients. At the same time, more and more standards were coming our way, and more requirements that we have as institutions for internal steering, and stakeholders that require more and more transparency in what we are doing. I think more importantly, even, we also see that if we as a world want to make progress on the SDGs, in particular in emerging markets and developing countries, we need to make sure that we have the tools to measure and report and drive impactful actions. And I can go on. And this is why we started this initiative a few years ago, and really align and harmonize on our impact models. And the joint impact model was born. Over the past 2 years, as a collaborative, we worked together, different organizations chipping in to develop the GHG further, and more organizations signing up. And I'm actually quite proud that we have now over 80 organizations that subscribe to the GHG. But being successful and filling a need also meant that we needed to find a more sustainable solution for the GHG going forward. And for that, we are very proud that we have now been able to set up a non-profit foundation. And yes, today we will be formally launching this, and we would really like to thank everyone for contributing to the GHG over the past years. With our non-profit Joint Impact Model Foundation, our aim is to provide the tools so all of you can measure and report on impact in a consistent and comparable way and drive impactful actions. And are we there yet? No, our GHG is not yet perfect. But with our non-profit foundation, we will be able to set up an organization that can drive further development of the tools, also towards other areas like biodiversity. We can provide better services and support you as our users. We will do this for a marginal cost, and will reach out to users to explain more about the setup of the foundation, the future of the GHG, and what we need from you and how can we work together going forward. Once again, thank you all for your support over the past years, and we really look forward to make the GHG Foundation a great success. So before now moving to Sam, don't forget, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. Our colleague Alex will keep an eye and make sure that after every speaker, we'll try to answer some of the questions before we move on. So with that, Sam, please take the floor.
Thanks, Dietske. Yeah, and since this webinar is about understanding GHG emissions, and if you're discussing calculating emissions for financial institutions, the natural place to start is PCAF. So I want to start with a brief introduction of PCAF and then also give a little bit of an idea of how we at FMO have calculated and reported our emissions using the global standard.
Yep, sorry, one sec.
Next slide, please. So for a brief introduction for those that are not familiar with PCAF, PCAF stands for the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials and is an industry-led initiative that started in the Netherlands in 2015. FMO was also a part of that initial initiative. In 2018, it expanded to North America and went global in 2019. And one of the major achievements was the PCAF global standard that was launched in November 2020, which is the first global standard for financed emissions accounting and reporting. This received the built on GHG protocol mark, which means that it is connected with the GHG protocol, which is the main accounting standard for emissions. FMO was part of the global core 16 financial institutions who comprised the global core team that developed the first version of the standard. Now we're a year and a half later, and the PCAF global standard is really the most widely implemented and standard, and it has also been officially adopted by the SDGs. There are more than 280 financial institutions that have signed up to PCAF, representing more than 75 trillion in assets, and this number continues to grow by the day. There are a lot of large commercial players that are part of PCAF, such as BlackRock, HSBC, Bank of America. And as I mentioned, the SDGs have now officially, a few months ago, also adopted the PCAF global standard as their official way of measuring portfolio emissions. Finally, the TCFD also recommends PCAF as a methodology to measure finance emissions. So it just shows that the adoption is really spreading quite quickly of the PCAF global standard. Next slide, please. In this slide and the next slide, I would like to give a brief introduction of what I consider to be the core concepts of PCAF. And the first concept is attribution. And this is the idea that you have to calculate the emissions for a portfolio by taking the emissions of a borrower and multiplying it with an attribution factor. And this attribution factor takes into account the share of financing of a financier in the economic activity that is being financed. And PCAF defines this attribution factor for different asset classes in the context of the joint impact model, which is mainly about corporate loans and project finance. The attribution factor can be roughly defined as being the outstanding amount divided by the total equity and debt in the client or the project. And below in this table, you see a simple example how this works. So you see three companies that have different emissions. This financial institution has different outstanding amounts in those companies. And then by taking the company emissions, multiplying with the outstanding and divided by the total debt and equity, we get attributed emissions for each of these companies. And if you sum these attributed emissions together, in this case, you get to total portfolio attributed emissions of 14,500. Now, last year, the attribution logic of PCAF was also implemented in the joint impact model attribution sheet. So users of the joint impact model are able to very easily implement the data necessary to implement PCAF attribution. Next slide, please. Second core concept of PCAF is the data quality score. So this is the idea that over time, in the beginning, financial institutions might not have perfect data. We all know that this is the main challenge that financial institutions face when calculating finance emissions. And the idea that in the first instance, you would make a very rough estimate for those emissions, and over time, you would improve this data quality. PCAF defines a framework for capturing this data quality in a data quality score. And this starts with the highest score, which is directly reported verified emissions from a customer or a project and goes down there. So score 2 would be unverified emissions directly reported by the client, or emissions calculated using energy consumption. Score 3 would be calculated using a production indicator. So for example, if you have a cement plant, you could, and you know the total production of the cement plant, you could calculate using emission factors the emissions. And then we get to lower economic emission factors modeling. So score 4 is when you use revenues to calculate emissions, and score 5 to use you estimate using outstanding amounts. Now, the joint impact model is very useful because it allows users to calculate emissions using revenue and outstanding amounts. So those scores 4 and 5 can be calculated directly using the joint impact model. In addition, you're also able to input, if you have emissions data directly from clients, you're also able to input that in the joint impact model directly, and then combined with attribution data in the GIM, it will give you also the attributed emissions. So it allows you to both enter the emissions if you have them, and for those where you do not have them, using revenues or outstanding amounts, it fills the gaps to get to a complete picture in terms of emissions for your portfolio. Next slide, please. So this is what also we have been working on at FMO. In our last annual report 2021, we published this graph, which captures the emissions that is contained within FMO's portfolio. The acronyms here stand for the departments within FMO. So AFW is our agriculture department, where you see that there is a bit of scope 1 emissions, and then also quite a bit of scope 3. The energy EN department is interesting because they have a bit higher scope 1 emissions, and that is because there is quite a bit of fossil fuel investments that are still our legacy from older fossil fuel investments that are responsible for these scope 1 emissions. Then we see the FI department. So what we've done is that we've calculated the scope 3 emissions of our clients mainly with the joint impact model. And there we see two categories: the purchased goods and services and the investments. And the investments are modeled with the joint impact model. And we see, of course, that when we invest in other banks, then their scope 3 investments is a large share of their carbon footprint. And finally, for our private equity department, PE, you see that there's quite a mixed balance of different types of emission categories present. So I hope this was helpful. It's a brief introduction of PCAF and FMO emissions, and I'll hand it over to Annelies. And of course, if there are any questions, I'm sorry to take that.
Yeah. Are there any questions in the chat? Oh yeah.
The question is, what are the acronyms in the presentation?
Yeah.
Can you repeat that once more?
Yes. So AFW stands for agriculture, food and water, which is our agriculture department. EN stands for energy. FI stands for financial institutions, which are mainly investments into local banks in developing countries. And PE is private equity.
There's another question. Does this chart also take into account avoided emissions?
No, it does not. PCAF in the reporting chapter says that you have to report separately absolute emissions and avoided emissions and emission removals. Those need to be reported separately. So this graph only takes into account absolute emissions. In our annual report, we have also reported separately on avoided emissions.
And there's a last question. What falls under the scope 3 investments, scope 1 and 2 of the clients?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question because the PCAF global standard does not detail, it has 6 asset classes, but it does not detail very specifically how to treat these what we call FMO indirect investments. So whether or not to take into account scope 3 investments or scope 3 category 15 of your clients is not very clear. We made an FMO our own assumption that we take into account scope 1, 2, and 3 of our clients with the sort of the logic that we footprint our clients, and PCAF right now only says that you need to report scope 1 and 2, but there's a phase-in of scope 3. So the idea that eventually also all banks need to report the full scope 1 and 2 and 3 of their clients. So also when we account for the emissions of other local financial institutions, we also should take into account the full scope 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, we have still some time, just to keep an eye. Just to be sure, the GHG emissions here include both CO2 and non-CO2 emissions, or only CO2 emissions?
Yeah, they include both, since we use the joint impact model, and the joint impact model also is able to model both CO2 and non-CO2 emissions. And
then there's another question. Do data quality scores differ for GIM, or is it the same as PCAF?
Yeah, I think this is a topic that Julia might touch upon later. Right now, there is a quality scoring in GIM, but it's not aligned with PCAF, and this is a work item that is on our list to align these in the future.
Yes, but I think that is a nice bridge actually to Anise. Or is there another question coming in? Okay. Do you have a high-level reason for why the scope 3 for the FI portfolio is so high?
Yeah, I mean, that's so if you look at FMO, for example, if you look at our own scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, that is also reported in our annual report, I believe it's around 2,000 tons. So just to give an example, these are emissions that are related to gas use in our buildings, heating in our buildings, some personnel travel. But if you look at our portfolio emissions, those are around 5 million. So you see that for most financial, so for us, that's about 1,000 times higher. And this general pattern you see also for most financial institutions. So when we invest in another financial institution, you can generally expect that their own emissions, so their own scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are quite small. It's usually just a little bit of building emissions, maybe some travel, and the really large part of their footprint is also in their scope 3 category 15 in their scope 3 investments.
All right. So then let's move to Anise. So thank you, Sam. And if there's any more questions, feel free to still type them in the chat.
Hi, sorry, we're just having some technical microphone issues, but I think we're sorted now. Great. So in this section, we're going to talk a little bit more about what type of emissions that GIM can help you quantify in terms of this scope. So it feeds on quite nicely from some of the questions Sam was just answering there. And look at how the GIM can be used for your PCAF aligned reporting. So what type of emissions does the GIM help you quantify? As we've just seen from what Sam was talking about, this is a tool which is designed to help institutions which have a business lending or an investment portfolio to help them quantify the impact of that portfolio. So this really is part of your scope 3 emissions, known as your financed emissions or category 15. And they're part of that downstream scope 3 emissions for you as an institution. However, within these financed emissions, there are scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of the borrowers or the client companies. So looking at what the GIM covers itself, the GIM covers the direct, the supply chain, the wage-induced and customer-enabled impacts across a range of metrics, being jobs, value add, and emissions. For customer-enabled impacts, it's looking specifically at the power and financial institution customers. Results across all types of impact are available, and the Scope 1 emissions you see from the joint impact model are the financed emissions from the operations of your client companies or borrowers. And these align with the direct jobs and value add that the GIM will provide. The Scope 2 emissions are those from the purchasing of electricity and form part of that supply chain impact, whereas the Scope 3 emissions are those from your upstream supply chain, excluding the electricity purchasing, as that falls under your Scope 2. And this makes up the rest of the supply chain impact. So your Scope 2 and 3 emissions, when they're combined, are the ones that can be compared against the value add and the job results. The GIM also does allow insight into things that go beyond Scope 1, 2, and 3, particularly around wage-induced and the impact of provision of power. These are things that we model both on jobs and value add, and therefore we provide the emissions figures there. However, they're beyond what would be required when reporting on emissions. Alrighty, thanks, Julia. Next slide. So what scope of emissions do you need to report for your PCAF aligned reporting? Currently, the standard talks about financial institutions should report borrower and investee absolute Scope 1 and 2 emissions across all sectors. So at a minimum, we need to quantify the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the borrower and clients. However, it also states that we should follow the money. And so this is that key part about financial institutions. If you're invested into financial institutions, looking through to their underlying portfolio. And in this, you really want to be looking also at a bare minimum, the Scope 1 and 2 emissions. The GIM can help you quantify all of these areas. And if you see in the diagram, the GIM can help quantify all things under the investment footprint that are outlined here, depending on data availability. So if we take, for example, a fund investment, to help us understand this a bit more, with a fund investment, when it comes to what is the emissions we need to be reporting, this could be the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the fund itself, the operations, the offices, etc. of the fund. However, when talking about following the money, many people feel that it's important, therefore, to follow through and look at the emissions from the constituent companies that make up that fund. And here again, they have Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions that can be modelled from the GIM. However, this chain can continue on, right? So if that fund invests in financial institutions, then they have their own investment portfolio as well. And so do you need to go down that chain all the way to the bottom? And how far can you go is a question we're often faced with. Right now, the requirements are to make your best effort and go as far as you can. And so for this, it's really about data availability and where the bulk of the emissions are likely to be and where you can realistically model your emissions. So if we go on to a couple of examples of how different institutions have looked at this. So given that data availability and the follow the money principle is open to interpretation, different institutions have interpreted this differently. And we see this among several of the GIM users. So here are two examples of the ways people have interpreted what they need to do when reporting PCAF aligned results using the joint impact model. For the first example, you can see this institution has gone pretty broad in the way it's interpreted what it needs to do. For its direct investments, it's looked at the Scope 1 and 2, but also included Scope 3. which is going above and beyond the minimum requirements. For their fund investments, they've been looking at the scope 3 of the fund. So this is the financed emissions of the constituent companies. And here, when those constituent companies are an FI, they followed that all the way through and looked at the emissions in the borrowers of those FIs. So followed that chain as far as they possibly could. And in their financial institutions, they look both at the bank itself, its operations, as well as its portfolio. So this is a pretty extensive approach and gives a very full picture of the emissions reach. Whereas when you look at the second example, this DFI has taken a more conservative approach. It is reporting on scope 1 and 2 emissions only currently, as the requirement is, but it does use that follow the money principle in order to, within the funds, look at the scope 3 emissions from their constituent companies. However, it doesn't take it down to that level that the first DFI did when it comes to FIs within funds. And so you can see here, although both these institutions are following PCAF, if we were invested in the same fund or the same FI, the results we would have using the same tool and the same standard would give us significantly different results. On this, we really hope to see more work on either the standard and harmonization in the future, so that we can make our results more comparable and more consistent between the GIM users and those reporting against the PCAF standard. But I hope this gives you some insight into how you can apply the joint impact model for your PCAF reporting and what the different things you need to think about when thinking about the scope of your reporting and the data availability you have. I'd like to open up for questions.
There's a question coming in. The depth of look-through can be quite varied using the follow the money principle amongst DFIs, in FMO's experience. Do we already have an idea of what is being adopted as common practice or intended to be initially followed by financial intermediaries, for example?
So from what I've seen in the industry, we are seeing that it is pretty standard to bypass fund managers themselves and look at the underlying companies within funds, and also within if you have financial institutions within your portfolio, to definitely look at both the bank there and also its emissions. I think there is still a lot of variation in whether people include scope 3 or not. However, I believe most people are expecting scope 3 to come into the standard in the near future, and that will force us, those who aren't doing that yet, to take that step and bring some further alignment. I don't know if anyone else has any comments on this question.
Yeah, I think I've not. It's still a little bit varied. I think there's still quite a bit of. There's not a real one approach to it, and I think it's also because you can go multiple ways with the follow the money principle. In how you report in terms of scopes. So I don't really see a big consensus on this topic, to give a short answer.
All right, so we also have some questions in the chat. So first question, may I ask you to elaborate on whether the model allows to estimate scope 3 emissions for different companies? If so, what statistics is used for such estimates? And there's also another question, but let's first do this one.
Great, thank you. The model does allow you to model scope 3 emissions. In the joint impact model, it traces the financial activity of the company through the supply chain using the social accounting matrices. And that is what's used as the basis of your company's likely impact across different sectors. And then it uses those same GTAP emissions factors of revenue emissions by sector to convert that flow throughout the supply chain into your scope 3 emissions. It's worth noting that it does follow your supply chain all the way through. So it's not just the direct suppliers, but also suppliers. And additionally, it will give you your results as emissions from local supply chain as well as emissions from imported supply chain.
All right, and then the second question in the chat: if a DFI is measuring scope 1 or scope 2 emissions for its borrowers, do they do it for the full portfolio or only for large loans?
For most DFIs that I'm aware of, they do it for their full portfolio where data is available. There may be some instances or some cases where data availability makes this challenging. From my experience, scope 1 and 2 emissions for either larger loans or those that are in sectors which are likely to have higher emissions, they tend to attempt to get either reported data or use an alternative approach using physical data. So on that data hierarchy that Sam was showing, they try and get to levels 3, 2, and 1 rather than using the 4 and 5 approach. And then the levels 4 and 5 in the joint impact model is used for those to help fill the gaps and make sure you get as much coverage as you can across the portfolio.
All right, and then there's a few more questions in the Q&A. What exactly is the calculation methodology for scope 3 emissions of individual companies that is used in the GIM? In what way is it more precise than, for instance, running the calculations using spend?
So the joint impact model uses the spending pattern of businesses through the economy. So it is using the spending data. It uses the social accounting matrices to estimate where that spending is likely to be, in which sectors it's likely to be based on the sector and country of operation of your business, and then follows that through the economy. Have I answered the full question? Thank you. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily more precise than using spending data. Depending on what approach you're using on your spending data, it does take it to the sector level and model that through the sectors based on that country and sectors tables.
You can also enter spending data.
Yes, thanks, Julia. Yes, as my colleagues mentioned, you can also include not just the revenue data, but you can input actual amounts spent on the supply chain in order to get more precise estimates rather than it using your revenue data to estimate how much you spend on your supply chain. Good point.
Right, next question. Is the GIM model different from the tool provided by PCAF?
So the tool provided by PCAF is, I believe, based on XIO-based. Maybe Sam, you should answer this one.
Yeah, indeed. PCAF provides a database for signatories. That also includes economic emission factors in terms of ton CO2 per million euro outstanding and per million euro revenue. And that uses XIO-based, which is a different input-output model than the one that is underlying the joint impact model, which is GTAP. And you can compare GTAP and XIO-based, and there are a few advantages and disadvantages. XIO-based has a higher sectoral coverage, but the advantage, especially for DFIs, is that GTAP has a much more granular regional and country coverage. So there's much more detailed data available for a larger amount of countries, especially in the developing world.
I think the other thing from our side is that the joint impact model provides an interface which uses a relatively data-light approach, and so should be accessible to those who aren't necessarily as familiar with using the PCAF database.
Yeah, exactly. PCAF is just a database, and it's not a ready-made tool.
All right. Yeah, I think we still have some time. Is it safe to sum CO2 and non-CO2 emissions, noting that their impact intensities are different?
So the joint impact model gives the results in tons of CO2 equivalents, and I believe it is common practice to sum these. I don't know if you have anything to add on this.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it can be interesting because the CO2 and non-CO2 emissions are based on different databases from GTAP. So it can be sometimes interesting to see, especially in the agricultural space, if your emissions are very high for a particular investment, to see if it's because of the CO2 and non-CO2, it gives some insights. But in terms of the reporting, PCAF does not require separate reporting in terms of CO2 and non-CO2. It just requires an aggregated reporting on ton CO2 equivalent.
Yeah, but you can see it separated in the GIM data.
Yes, when you get your results from the joint impact model, it will give you your CO2 and your non-CO2 results separately if you wish to separate them out or do any analysis upon that.
All right, and the next question, in cases where data is unavailable for scope 1 and 2 emissions for portfolio companies, what metrics data do you use to calculate GHG sector emissions or sector revenue in different countries?
So when you don't have scope 1 and 2 emissions data for portfolio companies, the model uses the revenue data in order to estimate this for your scope 1 emissions, as well as your scope 2. However, if you also have purchasing data on your spending in the supply chain, it will then further refine the scope 2 emissions analysis using actual purchasing data throughout the supply chain. And the results are done on a country and sector basis, or if a country data is unavailable, it will be done at the regional level.
All right. Another question. When looking at these examples, the examples that we see in the slide, what is the expected deviation in the emissions between the DFI 1 and DFI 2?
That's a very good question. I've not done this comparison, so can't say for sure, but I think the lack of inclusion of scope 3 would make it significant. If you look at the examples Sam showed for FMO, maybe it's good to put that up. What you're seeing here on this slide, the parts that wouldn't be included would be anything that's listed under scope 3 purchasing of goods and services. So those orange bars would not be included if FMO took DFI 2's approach. And also the only part that you would see the scope 3 investment would be under the FI category. So in their PE funds, for example, they would not have taken those emissions there. So it would be a significant reduction in results.
And for FI would be partial.
Yes, the blue bar in FI would only be the scope 1 and 2 in the investments portfolio. So there would be a significant drop down in that as well.
All right, I think still 2 questions to go. How do you calculate own operations emissions? Will it be based in revenue data or base it on actual expenses?
So for your, I assume this is referring to you as the bank or DFI. In that case, we would encourage you to do a more detailed approach for your own emissions of scope 1 and 2. This tool is really designed for looking at the financed emissions within your portfolio. I don't know if Sam, you want to give any comment around doing
so for calculating your own operational emissions, this is based on the GHG corporate protocol, and yeah, you have to see what is relevant. For example, if there's a gas boiler or an air conditioning that uses electricity, then you would need data from, let's say, invoices that detail how much gas you've used or how much electricity you've used, and then calculate that with appropriate emission factors. Similarly, as for example, for scope 3, in the case of FMO, personnel travel is a relevant category. In that case, you might need information on kilometers traveled by plane, and also there find an appropriate emission factor. I think for most banks, the data collection should be fairly manageable, but of course, if you have many different operations and many different sites, that might become a bit more complicated.
All right. Another question, does GIM cover all emerging market countries?
So the GIM tool itself does cover all emerging markets. However, there are the tables that we use are from GTAP, and they don't necessarily have a table for every single emerging market. In the cases where those tables aren't available, and you select one of those countries, it will default you to the regional table for that area.
Would you also be going through the GIM input tool during this call? No, let me answer. We won't, because it's too short. I mean, we love to talk about the GIM, but I think what we might be doing is update everyone after this session with what we discussed today, and we'll definitely organize follow-up webinars. So if you have suggestions, please let us know for what would be interesting to you.
Yeah, and just to add to that comment, as of next year, as Dietske mentioned, we will be asking for a fee to be able to use the GIM, and that will include 2 hours of one-on-one consultation where we go over how to input the tool, how to input your data into the tool. So because we know that it's not easy to do that if you're not comfortable with it or used to it. So that's something also to keep in mind, that the training will be included with the fee that we'll be asking for starting next year.
And we also intend to release training videos to help going forward in the future. So there'll be several opportunities to learn about the input tool, but of course we can definitely host a session specifically on that.
And I think on that note, perhaps over to you, Julia.
All right. Yeah, so what I will be doing is I'll be talking about the next steps and the upcoming versions. So we have one major update scheduled for the end of the year. We will further improve the user friendliness. So we want to have easier login management. So if you have somebody leaving the organization and you want somebody else to sub in for using the GIM, that will be much easier. You won't have to go through us, and we will use a more sophisticated method to do your logins. We will also are planning on improving error messages. We want to have an input sheet with examples and with descriptions of the examples, so that it's easier for you for a particular investment to follow the input sheet that we will prepare. And then, as Anis mentioned, we will have training videos available to go through the different types of investments, different types of projects, and how to fill that out in the GIM. And we also want to further improve the GHG emissions. We're also working on the job side, of course, but since this call is in particular on a deep dive of GHG emissions, we will talk about that. We want to improve estimates for renewable energy projects, which is something that we see as a weaker point in the GIM. We also want to enable what's called the fallback calculation, where you can just enter your outstanding amount in a particular project or corporate, for example, and then it will do the calculations so that you don't need revenues, because sometimes it's hard to collect revenue data. And that is one of the options that PCAF gives. As Sam mentioned earlier, we do want to align with the PCAF quality score, because right now there is misalignment with our own quality score that we have. And the other thing that we want to add is we want to improve how the GIM handles personal loans and mortgage finance. Something also that I wanted to mention is that is not slotted for the end of this year, but we will commence work on doing a physical data tool so that you can enter more specific information about your projects. But in order to do that, we need to align with the different institutions that are working with us on putting together a tool that can really help with physical data. So, for example, if you know how much fuel your client is using, if you know how much electricity they're purchasing, that kind of stuff, we want to include as a tool. And now, are there any questions in the chat about the updates?
No,
let's give people a minute to see if they have any questions on what's next.
Okay.
If not, we can
pass it over to Alex. So, Alex, I will put myself on mute now, and then you can put your microphone on.
Thank you, thank you, Julia. It's great to interact with all of you on the webinar. Thanks for making the time available. And I know we've got people from Nigeria, Nepal, and the Americas. So kind of truly a global call. So as Dietske was saying at the beginning, it's really exciting that we now have this non-profit foundation to be a home for the model. And one of the things that I'm particularly excited about that is that it enables us to talk to other foundations and other non-profit partnerships about kind of expanding the scope of the tool and how it can be used. And so Dietske mentioned, I think we have, we started this with a small group of development finance institutions, Stuart Red Queen, the consultancy, some academic partners, and the African Development Bank. So sort of 10 co-founders. We've got 80 users currently, but many of you will know that there are 65,000 banks and other deposit-taking organizations in the world. And the kind of lowest estimate in developing countries, at least 3,500 banks and many other financial institutions, microfinance institutions, etc. In Nepal, I think, Sharad, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but the latest I saw was 27 banks. In Ecuador, 24 banks. In South Africa, 35 banks. Egypt, 40 banks. And most of these banks, we've noticed, are not yet signed up to initiatives like PCAF. They are not yet signed up to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. They're not members of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. They have not submitted science-based targets for net zero plans. And so that we are worried as development finance institutions, we're worried that these banks are not getting access to the best tools to start their net zero journeys. And in particular, we're also worried about the kind of very strong focus on carbon, and that what we want banks to do is plan a just transition in developing countries so that they can take account of decarbonising their portfolios while maintaining jobs that they support in the economy. And so I think that it's exciting to have this non-profit status so that we can do fundraising, so that we can support banks. And in fact, we have NNB Bank on the call today. Sharad, thanks for making yourself available. We've also been talking to various other banks in developing countries, in Ecuador, in South Africa, and in Egypt, among others. And what we hope to do in the second half of this year is work more intensively with a group of banks, maybe 6 or maybe as many as 10, depending on whether we can secure some technical assistance, finance to do this work, and to really help the banks do their first good enough quality carbon footprint, but also to explore the jobs and GDP estimations from the tool and start to think about how they will decarbonize over a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year period, while making sure that they are fully supportive of economic activity in the countries. So we think this is really exciting. This is a much bigger user group than the world of development finance. World of development finance, I think, is probably, Dietske, I don't know, 100 billion euros of development finance in developing countries, but the banks themselves, it's probably 10% of global finance. So, trillions of US dollars of domestic credit going into businesses, and millions of businesses being supported by these banks. So we really hope that we can scale up the usability of the banks. And I noticed we had a question from our colleague in Nigeria, InfraCredit. How can InfraCredit get involved? Well, hopefully if we can receive some technical assistance, then we could support you in starting to do your carbon accounting over the second half of this year. In 2023, we will, as Julia mentioned, introduce some very modest user fees for banks. And we will also explore ways of subsidizing that for banks in developing countries so that everything remains as affordable as possible, given that we need to maintain good quality. So that's our kind of plan for kind of expanding the scope. And one thing that we're particularly excited is that we've got some people on this call already starting to kind of explore this. The client banks of development finance institutions, I think, is about 250 banks in developing countries already. So even if we as development finance institutions can encourage just our clients in countries to use it, already we can sort of double the size of the user group that PCAF's achieved so far of 280 banks. We could get to 500 without too much difficulty. And then I think those banks are often the best banks in the country. That's why we finance them. So they have a big demonstration effect on the rest of the sector. And they can also help influence the central bank in the country to start thinking about encouraging other smaller banks and other non-banking financial institutions to also get started on carbon accounting. So we can see a snowball effect starting to come here, where more and more banks can start reporting consistently. Civil society can then look at these reports, and they can start to kind of work out which banks are doing a good job of decarbonising in a responsible way, which banks are moving more slowly. So you can also build in some accountability to the mechanism. So that's briefly our plan for the second part of the year. And please, if you are headquartered in a developing country, please do contact us so we can consider you for joining this pilot project. And I think, as Anise made clear, and also Sam, in any given country, there's all sorts of issues and difficulties about kind of which sectors to use, how do you get the data, how do you consistently deal with local currencies, etc., etc. So we'll be doing some troubleshooting and improvements over the second half of the year. But I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions. I don't see too many questions, but one from Emmanuel on GHG savings.
No.
Emmanuel, I think just to briefly answer your question, I think do you mean by GHG savings, do you mean avoided emissions? There is another tool also developed by development finance institutions called Frescoes, which deals with calculating avoided emissions from forestry sector. It was co-developed by FinFund and British International Investment and a few others. So you can use that tool. What we don't encourage and nobody encourages is to deduct avoided emissions from emissions. So they should be reported separately. They can be on the same page, but it shouldn't be a kind of a netting out of emissions minus avoided emissions. I hope that answers that question.
I think just to add to that, Alex, from a joint impact model perspective, we're focused very much on getting an accurate footprinting as we can and improving that part of the model. However, if further down the line there's a big need for, and it would be advantageous to do so, to include avoided tools and Frescoes tools, we can definitely look at bringing those into the model further down the line. But right now we're focused on improving the current functionality.
And Fresco, F-R-E-S-C-O is the name of the tool. Sam probably can remember what it stands for, or I think Shibar is also on the call and will remember. I'm going to guess that the F stands for forestry, but I can't remember exactly what the acronym means, but if you Google Fresco, you'll easily see it.
The acronym is for Forest Carbon Sequestration.
Thanks, Sam.
All right, so Alex, I think you can start closing off, looking also at the time.
Yes, indeed. Yes. So look, thank you very much for attending, everybody. It's really great to kind of see such a range of financial institutions and others who are interested in the tool. I'm sure you'll all have questions. Julia is a great point of contact for those follow-ups. Some of you, I think, are already in our network. Others, hopefully, we look forward to welcoming you into the network. Please do also spread the word. If you can think of other financial institutions that should be doing carbon accounting, do encourage them to get started. We're trying to make this as easy as possible for people while still maintaining good quality. And for those of you who are interested, there's a session in the London Climate Week tomorrow by an organisation called Accounting for Sustainability. And I'll also be presenting there alongside my colleague Justine Bolton, Standard from First Rand Bank in South Africa, as well as Matt West and Standard Chartered at that session. I can share a link to that session. There's still spaces for registration on that. So we're continuing to do outreach, letting people know about the tool. And if you have ideas, please do contact us. This started as a collaboration. It will continue as a collaboration. So the more ideas, the better, as far as we're concerned. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all.